This is a production of Cornell University.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, thanks, Tony. Appreciate everyone coming out this afternoon. So I'm going to be talking about perennial grains. This is a bit of a new area of research for me, so I don't have a whole lot of data to show you, but I'm going to be telling you what we're up to in my lab. And so I just want to share a little nugget of information. So on my profile online for the section, not the department, I have a research description, and I say what I'm interested in, and cover crops, as Tony was mentioning, sustainable cropping systems, ecological weed management, and I have 2 words. So I say I'm interested in perennial grains, and I received more comments, students, inquiries coming in from outside asking about those 2 words out of a 100-word description of my research than anything else that I do, even though I'm not doing a whole lot of work in this area quite yet. So there's a lot of interest, and I hope you enjoy what I have to offer here. So I have a lot of slides, so I want to just go through and tell you what the take-home messages are first, in case we don't get to the end of the presentation, and that is that perennial grains are becoming an option. All right. For the longest time, people have just talked about this as more of a dream. Well, now it's becoming a reality. So there's increasing interest and consumer demand. People have gotten wind of what's going on. There are people that are seeking out perennial grain products. And there are processors that are very interested in getting their hands on this grain. So really exciting time to be working on perennial grains. What fits into my research program, and one of the reasons why I'm very interested in perennial grains, is because they have a potential to provide ecosystem services and increase the sustainability of cropping systems. Okay. When we're thinking about perennial grains, because this is a new type of crop, the integration strategy is really important and critical for success. Okay, so exactly how we go about growing these crops, where on the landscape they're planted, and how they're managed. All right, so that's really important. And then with also being a new crop, guidelines. We need to understand how these crops grow, and we need some more information so that we can share this information with farmers and provide them with information on best management practices and ways to optimize production. Okay. So before I go any further, I just want to highlight some of the people who are involved in this research at Cornell and beyond. Sandra Wayman, she's really, so in the front here, she's been really leading the charge, keeping this project together, so very happy to have her involved. Valentine Debray, so this is Valentine. This is an intern from France, from Isera Lyon, who came over this past summer and helped with some of the research. Eugene Law is a new graduate student right here, working with Tony DiTomaso and myself. And then Steve Coleman. So this is Steve, having his arms up here saying, why aren't people growing more perennial grains? So he was actually from Cornell. He's an alum, so he came through the program here at Cornell. He's at Ohio State University now. He's really was my entryway into working with perennial grains. So he's the one that really got me first interested in this work. And then Lee DeHaan. He came and actually gave a seminar in this section a couple of years ago talking about some of the updates of his work at the Land Institute. Okay. So why focus on perennial grains? So again, thinking about why I'm really interested in this, it's a lot of it has to do with climate change. If you remember Mike Hoffman's presentation earlier in the semester, climate change is a really big deal for agriculture. There are a lot of challenges associated with climate change in the future, associated with the projections, and I see perennial grains as a way to deal with some of those challenges. The recent advances in crop breeding, I think, are really exciting, and so there's opportunity for seeing some pretty fast progress over the next several years with perennial grains. And then ecosystem services. People are starting to understand the importance of ecosystem services and the importance of how we manage our landscapes, our agricultural landscapes, so that we can achieve not only food production, but also some of these other environmental benefits that we get from agroecosystems. Okay. So with ecosystem services, in 2005, Jonathan Foley published this paper, Global Consequences of Land Use, and it was really calling for an integration of what we're seeing in natural ecosystems, where you have a lot of ecosystem services in this flower diagram. These are represented up here from forest production, carbon sequestration, a number of these on the bottom of the flower diagram here. And that's quite a bit different from intensive cropland, where the primary goal is crop production. Okay? And so what we're trying to do here is to combine these two, all right, so that we get the best of both worlds. And that's what we're seeing here with this cropland with restored ecosystem services. And we're seeing perennial grains as an opportunity to achieve this. Okay. There was a paper published not too long ago looking at the way that we can put perennials, in this case we're talking about perennials in general, not necessarily perennial grains, but how we can place these on the landscape to increase ecosystem services. And what they were seeing is that with just a small amount of perennials in the landscape, we can dramatically increase the amount of ecosystem services that we're receiving from these agroecosystems, and also achieve green or crop production at the same time. Okay. So if we think about why we're focused on perennial cropping systems, perennial grains, one of the reasons is because there are challenges with annual cropping systems. And if you take a step back and you think about annual cropping systems and the ecology of annual cropping systems, we know that these are good in that they are highly productive. So we're getting a lot of food out of annual cropping systems. Okay, but they often require very large amounts of external inputs. Okay, so Rich Smith came and gave a presentation in the section several years ago, and he had a paper that came out looking at agriculture, energy use, environmental impact, and he called into question annual cropping systems and said that what we're really trying to do here is maintain this perpetual state of secondary succession, of initial secondary succession. All right, and so we're doing that with disturbance, and we're doing that to increase resource availability. Okay, so in ecological terms, we're using these inputs to make resources available for these plants that we want to grow. Okay, and the environmental impacts associated with annual cropping systems is directly related to the energy that's required to maintain that state of initial secondary succession. Okay. So some more background information just here to set the stage. If we look at annual cropping systems, all right, here's an example. We see that there could be a lot of evapotranspiration, or evaporation, excuse me, a lot of runoff, okay, especially if you're on a sloped land like we have a lot of in New York. This is a photograph from 2015, all right, out at the Musgrave Research Farm, seeing some real erosion here. And so in 2015, in June, there was quite a bit of rain. So we had about 8 inches of rain, where our long-term average is about 4 out at the research farm. And for all of you who do field research, who are around this summer, we know that this past summer, 2016, it didn't look anything like this. It was actually the complete opposite. We had less than 1 inch. Okay, so we're seeing these dramatic swings in environmental conditions, in rainfall patterns, and I think this is going to continue, and we really need to help farmers deal with some of these issues. Okay, so going back to this diagram comparing annual and perennial cropping systems, perennial grains here. So you see these differences. So a couple things that I want to point out. So evaporation decreasing because we're having more ground cover here. Okay. You also see a larger nutrient pool that can be accessed by these roots that go down deeper with perennial grains compared to annual grains. Okay, less runoff and erosion. All right, and the other thing that's happening here, if you look at the diagram of the suns, all right, here, we're using resources over an extended period of time with perennial grain cropping systems. All right, where annuals you're planting in, say, April, May, okay, you're missing out on some of those heat units that happen before you plant your crop, all right? And the same thing after you harvest your crop in the fall. So with perennial grains, you're really taking advantage of all of the resources that are available throughout the year. Okay, so there are 2 main approaches for developing perennial grains. One is to domesticate a wild crop, or a wild perennial, excuse me. And the other one is to cross a crop, an annual crop, with a perennial relative. All right, so those are the 2 main approaches for developing perennial grain crops. And what the breeders are really trying to do is combine multiple desirable traits. So they're looking at regrowth perenniality is really important for perennial grains, okay, and high yield. So we're trying to get both of these together into the same plant. All right, obviously they should also be somewhat tolerant to abiotic and biotic stresses. So those are the goals for the plant breeders. And one of the big success stories is with intermediate wheatgrass. All right, so this is the scientific name is Thinopyrum intermedium. It's also called Kernza. This is the trade name that was developed by the Land Institute. So this is Lee DeHaan. He's the plant breeder at the Land Institute, and he's been developing this particular crop. So this was first identified in 1983 by Peggy Wagner down at the Rodale Institute. They called it something different down there. They called it wild triga. That name has not stuck, where Kernza has really taken off. Okay, and this plant, this was identified out of a screening that involved over 100 plants, 100 different species, and they found that this one was the best in terms of having these desirable characteristics. Okay. So this is what the grain looks like. All right, it has a hull on it, so like oats. So that's one issue that we've been dealing with, is trying to figure out how to get this stuff clean. And what's really exciting is that we're now seeing the first commercial production of this crop. All right, so these are some plots. This is in Kansas, looking at combine harvest of the Kernza, and this is what the grain looks like. All right. I think this is the nicest picture of the grain that I've ever seen. Our grain, the grain that we grew here in New York, doesn't quite look as nice, but we're getting there. I'm just going to pass this around so you can see, this stuff is real. Okay. And what's really exciting is that the first commercial product is now available. So Patagonia, the clothing company, outdoor clothing company, they have started a new offshoot company, new branch called Patagonia Provisions, all right, that uses the same kind of model that they use with their clothing company, where the clothing should be produced sustainably, to start looking at food. And so I think the original plan was that they were going to develop a granola bar, but they went with beer instead, all right? And so this is Long Root Ale. I actually have a can of this stuff. So Eugene was kind enough to acquire some of this beer, which was quite tasty when we tried it. But this is really exciting. Again, because people have always talked about this. For the past 20, 30 years, people have talked about perennial grains, but there was no commercial production of it. And that are now at this point is just really exciting. One thing, if you look at the fine print, it says free ground shipping on orders over $75. Unfortunately, we can't get it shipped to New York State. That doesn't apply for the beer. That's for the other products that they have. Okay, so just in case anybody was interested in ordering some Long Root Ale. Another exciting thing happening with Kernza is that was recently a proposal developed, and this is the front cover of this proposal, and this was for General Mills, the food company. The folks at the Land Institute have been in contact with General Mills, and they have had requested a proposal to support research on Kernza. And what they're trying to do here is to go back up the supply chain to try to find ways that they can meet their sustainability objectives. This is very similar to the work that Dr. Harold Van Ness, is doing with Walmart and using Adapt-N. So they're going up the supply chain to try to figure out how to increase the sustainability of their operation, of their corporation. All right? And so General Mills aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 28% by 2025. And so in order to achieve that goal, they're looking to utilize 18 million pounds of Kernza annually by 2025. Okay, so this proposal was developed, and what they're calling for here is the development of the Kernza Development Consortium. All right, and I really like this last part here, that's funded by an aggressive investment in research over the next 15 years. So I'm on this, I'm part of this Kernza Development Consortium, and I'm really excited to see this moving forward. Hopefully we'll be doing a lot more research on Kernza in the near future with help from General Mills. So again, the ecosystem services that we're talking about with perennial grains, we're talking about providing both food and potentially forage. It's not listed there, but carbon sequestration, habitat for wildlife, and when we're growing these crops as opposed to annual crops, we can reduce tillage, reduce our soil erosion, and reduce pollution from the inputs that we're using to grow these crops. So wanted to highlight some of the past work by Steve Coleman. So these plots are out at KBS. This was back a number of years ago, I think in 2012, maybe 2011. But Steve invited me out to KBS for part of this Perennial Grains meeting, and we got to tour some of his plots. And what they found in this research was that Kernza yields were quite low. Okay? Kernza is the perennial plant in the back. This is annual wheat in the middle here, and then this is perennial wheat. So the perennial wheat here, this is the cross. This is crossing the annual crop with the perennial relative. All right. Kernza, on the other hand, is the domesticated wild perennial. Okay, and so they saw that the yields were quite low. All right, with Kernza. Especially in the first year, they planted a bit late. All right, so in the establishment year, very low, but they got up to about a third of annual wheat in the second year. All right, they also found that Kernza reduced nitrogen losses and also had lower moisture deeper in the soil profile. There are not summary results for perennial wheat because the perennial wheat did not fare so well. Although the grain yields were higher in the first year. All right, it did not persist. All right, so it died off. So the perenniality, all right, is a really big issue here. With this one, good yields, but it did not survive. Okay. So when we look at some of these data, we're looking at soil moisture, all right, in the profile. So this is 0 to 20 centimeters, 20 to 40, 40 to 70, and 70 to 100. All right, and what you're seeing here is that the perennial grain, in this case Kernza, compared to annual wheat, right? So it's drying out the soil more, so it's utilizing soil moisture to a greater degree than the annual wheat. Certainly in year one over here, 2010, and then in 2011, it's more pronounced as you go deeper in the soil profile. Okay, so that was soil moisture. Here we're looking at nitrate leaching. All right, so they installed lysimeters in these plots. And they were looking at 3 different types of nitrogen source. So high nitrogen, a middle rate of 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre as urea, and then an organic source of nitrogen. So another 80 pounds as poultry litter. And what they're seeing here, again, the perennial grain Kernza is the blue line, all right, and you're seeing virtually no leaching. All right, so that Kernza, those deep roots, all right, you can see here, they're really sucking up that nitrogen, that nitrate, and preventing it from leaching out. So that's what we're talking about, reducing pollution associated with these inputs that we're using to grow our crops. There's also a lot of interest in using perennial crops like Kernza to increase soil carbon sequestration and as a tool for climate change mitigation. In our lab, I've been working on a review paper for the past year, more than a year, I think. But we're looking at different cropping systems, specific cropping strategies for working with perennial grain crops. One of those is using perennial rye, which I'll talk about in a second. All right, very similar to perennial wheat, where it's a cross between the annual crop and the perennial relative. Intermediate wheatgrass combined with a perennial legume forage, and then this one here, this highly diverse perennial grain polyculture. And so if we just start with that one, this is really what Wes Jackson was thinking when he does a lot of his talks about perennial grains. And this is, with this strategy, we're really trying to mimic nature, having all of these different species growing together. So this is supposed to simulate what we're seeing in the prairies, where you have different species and they self-regulate. And you can imagine that you can have quite a bit of ecosystem services coming from a situation like this. And so we are not actively working on developing this type of system, mainly because of the complexity associated with it. If we look at this graphic here, just this example, all right, if we look at the number of crop species that we're including in a mixture or in a polyculture, you can imagine that the ecosystem services, if you follow this line here, they increase with the number of crop species that you have, all right, and then you hit an asymptote. But the management complexity also increases, and we're not exactly sure what this relationship looks like in terms of management complexity. It could be a lot different than the shape of the curve that I just drew, but we know it increases. what we're thinking about is how can we do this? How can we be smart about putting these species together so that we can increase our ecosystem services, actually achieve a higher level of ecosystem services. All right, so here we're getting up to 9. All right, we're over here, we're only getting up to 7. And then also change and make sure that we're being strategic about our species that we're including so that the management complexity is also reduced. All right, so if you are strategic about it, we think that there is potential here. But again, the main concern here is with this management complexity and just being able to grow these crops together in a meaningful way. What does seem like we can get some traction with is with perennial rye. We're looking at this crop as part of at least thinking about it as part of a rotation where we have it in a rotation with annual crops where we can increase the soil health over several years and then rotate back to annual crops to take advantage of that increased soil health. So again, I already talked a little bit about this being a cross. These yields have been a bit higher than Kernza, at least in the past, with previous research. But there is some problems. And so with the title of the presentation, the promises, the problems, and the progress, I really want you to focus on the progress, of course, but there are some problems that we need to acknowledge. This is one of the problems with ergot. Ergot is a fungal disease, and it can be pretty bad in terms of the impact, health impacts. It's creates psychoactive compounds, so that's something that we really want to avoid. When I first started thinking about perennial rye, I thought we could use this for distilling to support the distilling industry around here. But it turns out that ergot, the alkaloids, will actually go through the distilling process, and so that really isn't going to be a viable way to deal with it. So we're looking at color separation for dealing with any ergot issues that we have with perennial rye. So this option, this of including intermediate wheatgrass with a perennial forage, this does seem like one of the most tractable ways to move forward. There's been a lot of progress with this. We're interested in combining these two different types of crops because of the ability of the legume to supply nitrogen to the kernza and also increase the forage quality. If we're thinking about dual purpose use of kernza, harvesting it both for grain and for forage, having a legume forage in there would certainly be nice. So when you are intercropping, one of the challenges, especially when you're dealing with perennials, is the managing competition. So depending on the time of establishment, if you're planting them at the same time or if you're trying to put in the legume later, you can have one species easily outcompete the other. And so we're taking an active look at that. We have a new experiment that Eugene Law will be helping with managing in the future. This was just established this past summer, and so this is comparing 2 annual grains to 2 perennial grains, and all of them have this split plot with red clover, so with and without red clover. And so this will be a 3-year experiment where the annuals are repeatedly planted, so kind of a worst case scenario to really look at what happens if you do something that you're not supposed to do, but comparing that to these perennial grains here. Okay. So our hypotheses are that soil health will be greater and pests will be lower in plots with perennial grains compared to plots with annual grains, right? And that red clover will increase grain yields and overall profitability. Okay. So in terms of our measurements, we're looking at crop performance indicators, biomass grain yield, and then also pests, grain quality, soil health indicators, and soil erosion. That's another factor that we're really interested in. This is what the plants look like 28 days after planting. So kernza over here, and then the perennial rye, right? These photographs aren't the best, but this was 55 days after planting, and you can see the differences here. So the kernza plots, all right, there is some green in there. It looks like a lot of soil right now, but being a perennial, this crop is just much slower than these annuals over here, okay? We came up with these varieties by working with some local farmers that we're collaborating with, and so these are popular varieties with them, and so hopefully they'll be interested in our results. And then this is what the perennial rye looks like. A little bit better than the Kernza, but not quite as good as those annual small grains. So that was a new experiment. I'm going to tell you about an experiment that we have been working on over the past 2 years. It was established in 2014, and this is with Steve Coleman, this dual-purpose Kernza experiment. And this is really one of the reasons why we're interested in conducting the experiment with Eugene, looking at combining the red clover with the Kernza. And that is because we're thinking that Kernza can be used for not only grain but also for forage production. And so the grain yields have traditionally been very low. Okay, we see that the grain yields typically peak at years 1 and 2, all right, and then they decline. They decline because of the plant being sod bound. Okay, so it's this plant is highly rhizomatous, and then it forms a sod, and this sod that limits really the reproductive tillering density, and can be very problematic in terms of maintaining grain yield. All right. Steve has done some work looking at fertilizer applications, and so Kernza does respond to nitrogen, but like many small grains, if you apply too much, it can fall over and result in lodging. So that's one of those issues. And there are goals in the objective. The questions that we're asking is, can we offset the low grain production with added value of forage? All right, and so we're trying to look at both grain and forage yields over a range of different environments. And then how can we mitigate the declining grain yields over time? And so what is the effect of defoliation on grain yields? Okay. So these slides, or some of this information, was recently presented at the Tri-Society meeting. And so these are the different locations where this research is being conducted. So we're here at number 5 here at Cornell. But you can see we're all over the U.S. So Colorado, Kansas, Maryland, Minnesota, New York, Ohio, Iowa, Wisconsin, South Dakota, and even in Canada. Okay. I just wanted to make a note that there are 30% of the people here are from Cornell. They've come through Cornell program, so there's certainly a Cornell connection with these different researchers. I think that's perpetuated by Steve Coleman, just knowing these folks, but interesting nonetheless. And so with these different treatments in this experiment, there are 4 different treatments. There's a control, this grain treatment where we're just harvesting the grain. There's a forage and grain, and then a fall cut. Okay. As we go through this, I really just want you to pay attention to these 2, the grain and then the forage and grain. So this is standard, basically the standard practice. All right. And then this is trying to get some forage from these plots in the spring and then harvesting for grain. We also had some nitrogen treatments using urea, applying at 2 different rates, all right, using a split application. And so I have some photographs for you. So this is the spring growth. This is in 2015, so it was planted in August of 2014. So this is overwintered in May. This is harvesting with the very old Carter harvester. So this is Brian Caldwell, one of the folks that's in my lab, harvesting on May 22nd. You can see what the plots look like after they were harvested. All right, cut to a height of 4 inches. One of the problems that we had with starting off this experiment was that we went into a field that had previously been planted to annual wheat. And so I was thinking that this was a good idea. The field was open, no big deal. And it turns out that there was a lot of contamination. A lot of the annual wheat wasn't collected in the combining process. It was distributed across the field, and so there were a lot of annual wheat heads mixed in with the Kernza, at least during the first year. Okay, and for the research plots, we had quite an amazing crew of undergraduate research assistants who went out and hand-picked a lot of the annual wheat heads, and I think they almost killed me for that, but it helped clean things up quite a bit. This is a picture of our plot combine going through the research plots. Another challenge that we had with this crop, with harvesting it, was direct combining. With the research plot combine, we did have a lot of clogging. A lot of the material wasn't completely dry. The thing is with perennial grains, so they're drying from the top down, right? An annual grain will dry from the bottom up, okay? And so when it's dry, you don't have to deal with wet material. You can go through with your combine. You have the cutter bar, it cuts everything, passes through the combine without any problems. Here, the lower you go, the greener it gets, okay? And so that was a bit of an issue for us, and so I think we learned a lot over the past couple of years. This was using the farm combine that has an air reel up at front, and this was a lot easier to use. It just had a greater capacity to get the material through the combine. It was fairly dirty. Our first harvest, we had a lot of extra material in there. We had a lot of annual wheat, despite the hand weeding, and so we weren't all that thrilled about our first harvest, but it's certainly exciting to see. And here are some of the plots that had nitrogen applied to them. You can see the extra green that you see here. This is where the urea was applied. And we didn't have a whole lot of impacts on the grain. We did see greater forage biomass production from the nitrogen, at least in the fall, but no effect on the grain yield. Here are the plots post-anthesis in July this past year in 2016. Okay, and now I'm going to show you grain yields across all 9 sites. So these are just box plots going from Colorado all the way on left to Wisconsin here in the 2 years. Okay, so average across all the sites, grain yields were a bit higher in 2015 compared to 2016, but overall very low. Okay, and so I encourage you not to think about this in comparison to annual grains, because that'll just maybe be a little depressing, but this is exciting. We are getting grain off of these perennial plants, okay? And I think that's the main takeaway point here, okay? It's a low yield, but it's something, okay? So if we look at just New York, all right? So here are the 2 treatments that I asked you to pay attention to in the 2 different years, all right? And so we're looking at basically the biomass, all right? So this is the straw, okay? This is the forage at the time of grain harvest, okay? These plots over here, they had the spring cut. So this is where we went in when it was still very green. We harvested these plots for forage, okay? And then we went back and we harvested them for grain, and then this is the straw yields associated with that grain harvest. Okay, so no real difference overall in terms of overall biomass production, but this, all right, this is quite a bit different material than this here. Okay, when we look at the forage quality of the spring cut, so the green material compared to the summer cut, we see that there are some pretty big differences. This is just an example of what we're shooting for with our forage quality metrics here. So crude protein, in this case, it was higher associated with the straw. Okay, if you think about it, there's probably some grain that's going into this, and that's driving up that straw protein value at the summer cut. Okay, but everything else, okay, so if we look at the relative feed value, okay, so a good relative feed value is above 150, so we're up to 214 with that early cut, okay, and so we're really excited about these results. We see that Kernza can make some very nice forage, and the next question is, well, does that forage clip really impact the grain yield, okay, and so although not statistically different, our first year we did see that the forage harvest we did see a numerically lower yield than just harvesting the grain alone. Okay, but overall, it wasn't all that consistent. Here we did see that same negative effect when we take the forage. We did have a lower grain yield, but in the other cases, again, no impact. Okay, and these are not all the same site years. Some of the other sites did not have this exact treatment or did not manage it the same way. So it's this is just a reduced set of those different sites. So in terms of the dual-purpose currency experiment, so yields varied widely. We saw that in terms of the control treatment, we didn't talk a lot about the control treatment, but that's basically just harvesting the grain versus going in and taking out the straw. When we take out the straw, we see some higher yields, all right? And so what I think is actually happening there is when you mow those plots after you harvest, you're actually getting some weed control associated with that. We did have some perennial weeds that crept into the plots, and so reducing that biomass, that standing biomass, was beneficial, all right? Spring clipping reduced plant height, and so in terms of the lodging problem, we think that that can help, especially if we are going to be adding nitrogen to try to increase our crop yields. And so, so we're really excited about this experiment. It's continuing. I want to shift gears a little bit and tell you about some other research that we've done in the lab. We conducted a survey of farmers. So we wanted to really know what's going on with farmers. Have they heard about perennial grains before? Are they interested in potentially growing perennial grains? And so this was a survey of farmers and also processors. We're still working on analyzing the processor data set, but we wanted to gauge interest. And this was conducted in France and in the US. So we have some collaborators, Christophe David at Isera Lyon, and this was Valentine's project over the summer. Okay, so we had a fairly decent response rate. So over 400 farmers responded to this survey. So a lot more in France. I think we could have probably done a better job getting the word out in the US, but we had a decent response rate, or a decent response anyway. We used snowball sampling, so we can't actually calculate a response rate because we don't know how many people saw the survey link. But we were happy to get this many people responding. And so I want to show you a couple of the results from this, this survey. Here we're looking at motivations for growing perennial grains. Okay? And so the number one motivation, and we have it broken out by organic and conventional farmers. So we looked at the demographics of the pool of respondents, and we saw that there was a nice split between organic and conventional, and that was somewhat intentional. We wanted to have a lot of organic farmers. So we see that this first one here, increasing or maintaining farm profitability. So that's the number one reason why farmers would be interested in growing perennial grains, and that sort of makes sense. This was significantly different. More conventional farmers than organic farmers were interested in that factor. Reducing inputs. Okay, so conventional farmers again want to try to reduce their inputs using this perennial grain compared to an annual grain. Reducing labor. So this is where the organic farmers, were more interested in reducing labor than the conventional farmers. Okay, the other thing that we see here, diversifying crop production. Again, a big difference between the organic and conventional farmers, with the organic farmers thinking that perennial grains can help them diversify. Okay, forage, all right, more of the organic farmers that we surveyed grew forage crops and had livestock. So this made sense to us that more of the organic farmers would be interested in using perennial grains for that dual purpose of both grain and forage. We also asked about concerns, so potential reasons why they might not grow perennial grains. And so what we see here is increased pest problems, so more organic farmers than conventional farmers. Both types of farmers were interested in or concerned about the low grain yield, high seed costs, and this lack of market where you can sell your crop. Conventional farmers were more concerned about low profitability. Okay, I thought this was interesting that in terms of low grain yield and low profitability, the organic farmers, they weren't as concerned about low profitability as the conventional farmers. So I think we'll just stop there with that survey graph. We also had some targeted questions. Okay, so some very specific questions that we wanted to get them to respond to, and they were asked to agree or disagree with these statements. So the first one is, I'm interested in dual-purpose perennial grains, perennial crops that can be harvested for both grain and forage. So more organic farmers agreed with that statement than conventional farmers, so 148 compared to only 36. And if you look at the percentage, so about 70% compared to about 50%. Okay? So this next statement, I would grow perennial grains to provide environmental benefits, even if they were not as profitable as other crops. Okay, so again, organic farmers tended to agree with that much more than conventional farmers. Okay. The last one here is research funding should be spent on annual grain crops rather than developing new perennial grain crops. Okay, and I was pleased to see that there was a lot of disagreement with that statement. So again, there was a difference between organic and conventional farmers here. More of the organic farmers disagreed with that statement compared to the conventional farmers. Okay. So we do see farmer interest in perennial grains, and there's a lot more that can be done with that survey. This is being worked up right now and should be submitted to a journal very soon. I also wanted to tell you about a new grant from Northeast SARE. It's titled Developing Perennial Grain Cropping Systems and Market Opportunities in the Northeast. We have quite an ambitious performance target with this grant proposal. We said that 20 farmers will establish perennial grains on a total of 400 acres, okay, reducing erosion, and we wanted to contribute to the sale of 150 tons of perennial grains, all right, in the Northeast. So, looking back at this, I feel a little crazy for thinking that we could do this, but I'm optimistic, and the reason why I'm optimistic is because of our team. Okay, we have an outstanding group of organic farmers working on this project, and an outstanding project manager, Sandra Wayman. All right, and these people are very committed to seeing this work. So we have some on-farm trials. We have a new experiment at Musgrave, the one I was telling you about with Eugene. And so we're going to be doing workshops. We have some tasting, and a tasting event that's lined up, and then with bakers and brewers and distillers, and also a on-farm field day. So these are our farmers that are involved in this project, looking at the plots over the summer. And so what we're going to be doing is looking at Kernza and then perennial rye. All right, these crops were planted this past September, and each of the different farmers are taking on a different research question. So Tor Oshner is looking at different ways to harvest the material, the grain. John Meyer is looking at spring fertility, fertilizer rates. And then Klaus Martins is looking at seeding rates. And so these questions were really farmer generated, which is really nice. I think they'll be more excited about the results than if we were just to impose what we wanted to do onto their land. And so this is Tor Oshner. We planted at his place on September 9th. We were very interested in working with Tor for a number of reasons, but one of those reasons was that in June of 2015, he had an incredible rain event at his farm. And so this was the wet year, right? He had 5 inches of rain in 1 hour and washed away a lot of his soil. So he's an organic farmer, he uses a lot of tillage, so he's really interested in ways to reduce tillage, and we're hopeful that we can integrate perennial grains into his operation in a way to help him deal with some of that soil erosion that he's experienced in the past. He stated in his letter of support that Wes Jackson, some of his writings, actually inspired him to transition from conventional production to organic production. So that was really exciting to see. He has experience harvesting different crops, somewhat unique or alternative crops, for seed. So he harvests buckwheat. Buckwheat is a crop that he swats, so he cuts it and then picks it up off the ground and puts it through a combine. And also red clover for seed. So he's also a part owner of a flour mill and a bakery. So he's vertically integrated, and we think that there could be a lot of opportunities to work with Tor to see this market be developed. So these are the plants 1 month after planting. The Kernza looks really weedy, unfortunately, but the perennial rye looks good. All right, here's John Meyer. So his plots were planted on September 15th. He's been a long-time collaborator with Cornell. So John Meyer really pays attention. We did some research with him this past summer, and we did some soil testing and some weed seed bank sampling. And we gave him some results, and he called us out on an issue that we had. He said, that doesn't look right. And we went back and we checked, and he was right. And so he's really engaged, and he does pay attention. So excellent farmer. He is also the owner of a distillery, all right along Cayuga Lake on the west side. And so we're thinking that we can work with him to really try using some of these perennial grains for distilling. Okay? These are what his plots looked like 41 days after planting. The perennial rye looking a little bit better than the Kernza at this early stage. And then Klaus Martins. So A lot of people know Klaus Martins. They have a feed company, seed and feed company, Lakeview Organic Grains. And again, a long history of collaboration with Cornell University. Excellent farmer. So these are pictures of his plots 35 days after planting, both the Kernza and the Perennial Rye. And so just to give you a sense for what the farmers are thinking at this point getting into this project, here are some early thoughts, some feedback they passed along to Sandra Wayman. So Tor, he says he's excited about Kernza. He heard about it years ago, but skeptical of the pathetic looking Kernza plants coming up. So Tor's, if you don't know Tor, he doesn't pull any punches. He's a fun guy, and I think he's joking around a little bit there, but he's interested to see how it does on his somewhat poor soil. Okay, John Meyer, he's a bit more, he's quiet. And he says he's curious. So far, he hasn't had a lot of feedback to share with us yet. Okay, Klaus Martins, on the other hand, he's very outspoken. He is very concerned about the small seed size with Kernza. He has lots of ideas. And whenever we go and visit with Klaus Martins, he has a number of different research ideas that he wants us to start working on, so that's always great. Has ideas for the breeders. So he compares it to emmer and thinks that forage is going to be critical for making this work. So we're getting close to the end here. Just some, I just want to highlight, we've talked a lot about the benefits. I really want people to understand that there are also some drawbacks. We are moving forward with this, but we are very well aware of some of the issues. So in true holiday spirit with the red and green, I have the drawbacks listed here. So the perennial grains are not going to address these food security needs and issues that we often talk about. Certainly lower yields than our annual counterparts. Quality, again, one of the reasons why we're working with Tor is because he's very in tune with grain quality. He has quality thresholds that he needs to meet with his grain, and so we are going to be working with him to try to figure out where Kernza and Perennial Rye fit in, what can be done with them in terms of processing. There is potential for pests to build up, crop rotation in annual cropping systems. All right, that is probably the best way, best cultural practice for managing pests. And so if we're not doing that in perennial grain cropping systems, there's potential for these pests to build up. Depending on where you're at, if you're using aquifers and irrigation, perennial grains might be an issue because of the water use. Okay, in the Northeast, we don't really see this being a big problem. A lot of times we have more water than what we need. But depending on where you're at in the West, that can be an issue. So, we covered a lot. Just to reiterate the take-home messages. So, perennial grains are becoming an option. There's increasing interest. We see ecosystem services. The integration strategy. Again, if you are using polycultures, putting the complementary species together, is going to be important. Where you put it on the landscape. Okay, instead of taking your prime ag land that you're growing annual grain crops in, perhaps putting them on sloped land or using contour strips. There may be ways that we can integrate perennial grains in a very meaningful way without getting ourselves into too much trouble in terms of having these low yields and decreasing profitability. So for agronomists in the room, so we really need more people working on perennial grains. We need to come up with best management practices and be able to provide farmers with information that they need to optimize production. So I'd just like to say thanks for people who have contributed to this project, people who have contributed seed, helped out with the field work, and also there are several people on here that are working on the review paper with me. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.